Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of GF International Solutions Chit Chat. Today's special guest is Michael Cooke, all the way from Northern Ireland. Michael, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing very well, Graham. Thanks for inviting me on to have a chit chat, as you described it.
Great. How's Northern Ireland at the moment? It's been a while since I've been back.
Yes, I would imagine it's probably the same as much of the world right now. We're all still living in different times, but as I look out the window, pretty beautiful blue sky out there. So you'd be grateful for the small things right now, I guess.
Brilliant. We've known each other for, I'm going to guess, around about 10, 12 years for all the work that I've done across in Northern Ireland and a variety of different programs with yourself and a few other guys as well. So do you want to tell everybody a little bit about what you do in terms of your job title?
Yeah, I'm a coaching consultant, so I work with a number of different sports to help them develop their coaching systems and develop their coach development offers, and I work also to support those sports, support their clubs. So basically in the sports development world, I do remember you coming over for the first time about 10 years ago. You had lovely blonde hair. I think I still had the same haircut at that point, but maybe a little bit more going on. But yeah, reminds me, some good memories there.
I'm glad you mentioned the blonde hair because we're doing this little section on vulnerability and especially vulnerability with sports people. And I've always said that they are probably the most vulnerable people that I've ever met and worked with, and I include myself there. But we also have the biggest game face. We create the best cartoon characters of ourselves that we show the outside world. And I guess as a former tennis player, having bleach blonde highlights, convertibles, and Armani jeans probably goes down to satisfying that a little bit, doesn't it?
Are you talking about Andre Agassi there or yourself?
Actually, I've never told this story on any of the chit chats, but when we were in Vegas, when I played tennis in the States, we were in Utah, so we ended up traveling to Vegas quite a lot for competitions and for matches and for the odd weekend gambling that the coach was never aware of. But we had one of the first sessions that we had there on the practice courts in Vegas. Agassi was training, and next was because he's got his academy in Vegas and he's from Vegas, and literally you've got this white boy from South Shields who's literally in 100 degrees in Vegas heat, is a beetroot face, Gatorade, bananas, and I'm done after about an hour and a half of training. And Agassi, his intensity for 3.5, 4 hours on court was immense, and I just thought, wow, that's a level.
Yeah, he was absolutely impressive athlete and really interesting story as well. I actually haven't read his. I love sports autobiographies, so that's one I haven't read. But anyone who's told me about his story and like falling in love and falling out of love with tennis and all the challenges that he faced in that, but still maintained an unbelievable level of performance all the way through his career.
Yeah, there's two things with Agassi. One is that phenomenal story that he brings where he was playing. He wasn't even playing the ATP Tour. He dropped down the rankings that much in order to get back following a wrist injury and falling out of love with the game. But two, how did nobody work out that baseball cap had a blonde wig underneath for so many years before he came out? He came out with no hair. Everyone for years were like, I want the ponytail. And it was a wig and it was a cap. But again, that shows the vulnerability sometimes of athletes and sports people, that we will go to that extreme to, keep the image, keep the ego without allowing people in, which can be very detrimental.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for many years, and people would say even now, showing vulnerability in sport was always seen as a weakness, as something to be avoided. And I know from speaking to a lot of athletes, it's not something that they're willing to share a lot of the time, especially with coaches, because there's this general feeling out there that if an athlete reveals an element of vulnerability or an element of weakness, it may cost them a place in the team. Yeah. It may cost them, a contract or a selection at some point in a squad down the line. And it's really interesting because that leads to a lot of other issues for that athlete, and having an element of vulnerability present, I think is important, and it's important that the athlete feels the ability to share anything that they're feeling. We've talked a lot about in the world of sport recently about mental health and well-being, and that's been so important this year more than many other years, due to the fact that we've been in lockdown and there's been a pandemic. And I think being allowed and feeling that you're allowed to be vulnerable at times is important. And I think you mentioned a few barriers to that, like ego, like fear of consequences. If we can remove those and say to that athlete or that person, it's okay to feel vulnerable, and it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling at that point. I think that's an environment as coaches that we should be looking to create. And I think if we can create those types of environments, then we may go a small way in towards improving mental well-being for many people out there, especially those that are involved in sport.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason why I wanted to talk to you, Cookie, was about this whole psychological safety areas for people to be in, and sharing that vulnerability and having this openness. One, I think, because it supports your mental health, and then it really helps you. Two is that there's a very small percentage of people play world-class elite professional sport, but there's not a lot of research in terms of how many people drop out of sport because of those issues and those concerns and things like that. And I was talking to Bevis Allen, and as part of this suite of resources, and he's worked with a lot of pro fighters, and about the vulnerability of boxers, and Tyson Fury recently coming out with a variety of things, Tony Bellew having a bit of a breakdown on the SAS program, and a variety, and Mike Tyson, you could name them, can't you? There's so many with boxers. And that's a very physical, a very demanding kind of strength in physical more than mental sport. And yet there's so many mental problems. And the conversation we were having was, when do you start to introduce this? Because if I look at my sport and my pathway as a junior, and being one of the best tennis players at 10s, 12s, 14s, 16s in my age groups, then it was all about winning. And there was no opportunity to fail. There was no real opportunity to lose and learn. It was about winning. So what happened was the system and the coaches, not that there was a lot of good coaches in those days. I mainly had all my coaching from my dad. And he wasn't a professional coach, but he was just a really good player, and obviously taking an interest in me. But I think I grew up with all of those barriers being put in place. That led to me when I went to the States, and then went and played on the tour. And by the time I've become an adult, I already have this ego. I have this brick wall. I have this kind of demeanor of vulnerability as a weakness. So when do we share this, and when do we start to develop it a little bit?
Well, an environment that has psychological safety present is one where someone can feel that they can be themselves, and perform, and it doesn't have to be sport, but it could be sport, that they can perform in a way that's true to themselves, and who they really are, without fear of consequences, without fear of their status, without fear of, in a work context, their employment, and really allows them to be themselves and thrive. And when would we want to start that? I think as soon as possible. If we you think about how many people, you mentioned there, drop out of sport, and we know, and there's I don't know if there's an exact figure around the world, but we know that lots of people drop out at certain times in their lives. If we were able to create an environment that allows someone to really be themselves, I think we could probably keep more people involved, and I think we could probably let people be in an environment that they really enjoy, that they really love. So in terms of when do we implement that, we implement that early, and that starts to allow people. We know in psychological safe environments, people can view learning in a different way. So one of the leading academics on psychological safety in the world right now is a lady called Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard. And she's done some fantastic work. I'm reading her book at the minute, Fearless Organization. And in that, she mentions a lot about, as well as some of her academic papers, how an environment with psychological safety influences learning. And people feel really secure and less vulnerable, or they feel that it's okay to be vulnerable in those type of environments. And when you feel it's okay to be vulnerable, or you feel safe to ask questions, you ask more questions, even the silly questions, if you like, but people feel they're silly. In those type of environments, there's no such thing as a silly question. So if there's something really important that you needed to know, but you were scared to ask it, you may struggle to find out the answer to it, or it may take you a lot longer. In a psychological safe environment, it's okay to put your hand up. It's okay to ask your peers. It's okay not to know. And that way, it changes the way we see learning, and we can learn a lot faster, and we can feel a lot more secure about things that we don't know, because we know this is an environment that is conducive to someone helping me learn and find out a little bit more.
Okay, really, really good. I'm just trying to think of where I go with that, because I've got three things floating around my head. First of all, we should mention the fact that I've always thought of you as almost an academic practitioner. So we should say that you are doing your PhD in this area at this moment in time to be Dr. Cooke, which would be pretty cool. But also you're still working on the ground. So you're taking the theory and turning into reality and practice, which I love, and that's certainly where I come from with the work that I do. There's the second thing about creating that safe zone. There's probably two things on that one. One is from the coach's side, and one is from the player side as well. So are coaches trained or qualified or focused on that creating of a psychological safe zone, or are they still more geared towards technique and winning?
Again, you're quite right in terms of sort of living in both worlds, in terms of academic side of things, but also the practical side of things. I generally feel that I'm saying this maybe more in hope than fully known, but I generally think there is a more holistic approach, certainly coming into the sport. There's still elements of what I would say potentially bad practice, where it's won at all costs. And the reason I think that's bad practice is that if you win at all costs, or you find a way to win at a young age, that's probably to the detriment of learning and development for any youngsters that are in those environments. So I do think it's getting slightly better. I think there are more and more coaches out there who are realizing, actually, I don't have to play my current top performers, because they might not necessarily always be your top performers. There's examples where people or coaches are looking more holistically at just, let's develop people, let's create opportunities for people to thrive. There's a good chance they will never go on, as you mentioned, to play high level performance sport. So let's just give them a wonderful experience, whether here now in our club environment or community environment or wherever. And that may help with dropout. So I would like to believe that we're getting there slowly but surely. And I think coach education, coach development has a big role to play in that. So helping coaches understand, because we're up against 50, 60, 80 years of culture where winning was the most important thing, and everything else was probably secondary. And there's still wonderful examples out there at not just the youth level, but high performance level, where and I'll get this in because I'm a Liverpool fan, but Jurgen Klopp, where he seems to create a wonderfully psychological safe environment for his players to express themselves, to be creative, to go and do their thing. And he also, you've got like John Wooden out there, like from what I understand from Pat Summitt as well, anything I've read about her. Some amazing coaches that have just created these wonderful environments that have helped people thrive as people, but also helped them be very successful as athletes too. So I think there are shining light examples out there that coaches can aspire to. And I believe we will get there, because what's going to happen is, if we don't get there, we're probably going to see more and more people dropping out of sport. We're going to see more and more people falling out of love with sport. And we'll see people choosing to consume sport in a different way. So we need really brilliant coaches that'll create these psychological safe environments, that'll allow people to stay involved for longer, to stay connected and stay in love with their chosen sport. And I believe we can get there. I believe there is good practice happening out there. So we just need to continue on with that and keep ourselves focused on those type of environments, I feel anyway.
And for those people who may be listening to us now, Cookie, who are thinking, well, listen to them two talking about sport and not talking about winning. Well, actually, we both have backgrounds where we've got to the stage where winning actually is the outcome. And that's all that it's about. It's about outcome and it's about winning. But that's further down the pathway. We don't need to be doing that at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-ish. We're probably getting there a little bit, aren't we? But up to then, it's about growth, it's about learning. And over these chit chats over the last, I think about nearly 100 of these now, is I've mentioned quite a lot about the New Zealand All Blacks regarding, better people make better All Blacks. Well, I just think better people make better people. It's pretty simple. And if we can look at coaches being better people first, instead of, I think they have a pressure on themselves to win, from externally as well as internally. So if we could remove that and give the coaches a psychological safe zone first, then they could maybe pass that on. And I don't think there's a difference between that and teachers and pupils in school. And I wanted to bring up this because the other part of that question is around the environment and the kids and the players. And we've just had information today about a 13-year-old boy who committed suicide based on the fact that he was just being bullied. So, goes to a nice school. I'm sure the teachers try to create a really good learning and safe environment for him to learn and develop and evolve in as a person. I'm sure none of the teachers would have wanted this to happen. But unfortunately, it happens somehow, doesn't it? And how do we try to take control of that in a sporting context so that, the coach can be that open and the player can be that open without any retribution of either bullying or Mickey taking or anything else that might lead to something more sinister down the line.
Yeah, and firstly, terrible to hear that, and my thoughts go out to that boy's family. It's so terrible when we hear something like that happening, and unfortunately, today it seems to happen quite a lot across the world. And you're right. And I think one point when we talk about environment, it's not just about the leadership who are responsible for psychological safety. It's everyone. So you could be, say, in a sporting context, feel really psychologically safe with your coaches and the people who lead those environments, the officials and so on. But actually, the people around you, your teammates, people in your social setting, if they don't make it psychologically safe for you, well, actually, the environment is not psychologically safe. You might have psychologically safe leaders who drive a psychologically safe environment, but if the rest of the environment doesn't follow suit, then there's chinks in the armor there. So I think it's quite important that psychological safety is not solely driven by leadership. Everybody has to buy into it, and everybody has to realize the impact that they play on others. And a lot of the psychological safety research looks at how informal leaders, so leaders without titles, people who have high social standing in any group or any environment, what impact they have on the environment and the psychological safety in that environment. So we all need to be working together. It's not a case of I'll lead from the front and everyone else will experience a psychologically safe environment. There's a lot of work that needs to be done under the water, if you like. If you see the tip of the iceberg, that's the environment that you might see. But all the interactions and engagements and relationships and communication that happens on that big bit of iceberg underneath the water, those are just as important as the bits that you see in the top, because those influence and underpin what you see. And it's massively challenging, when you hear a story like that, because it's you just want to avoid that at all costs. It's just terrible to hear.
Yeah, it is. It's really tough, and you see that a lot more in schools than probably what you would do in the world of sport, which is it's not necessarily a good thing, but at least you can kind of say, well, coaches are trying to make a little bit of an impact on trying to create this safety stuff. If I think about it from a layman's point of view or a parent's point of view or somebody who's not necessarily involved in sport from a playing sense, then we still have this 3 o'clock mentality, I think, especially in the UK, where everything's fine. You have your doctors, your nurses, you have your firemen, you have your lawyers, your solicitors, and then at 3 o'clock when the referee blows the final whistle, then everything goes nuts, and we have this kind of herd kind of mentality still. So we have campaigns about, we respect the referee, respect the game. Yet when I go down and watch football on a Sunday league football, I still see parents not respecting the game, not respecting the referee. So how do we translate? And I'm a big fan of understanding language and translating language. I think sometimes people speak in French and I hear it in English and I don't translate very well, but we mean the same thing. If I say to somebody on the street, you need to develop a psychological safe zone for your football coach, your football camp, then they're just going to turn around to me and go, Graham, what are you talking about? If I just say, hold on a second, we just need to be a bit more kind, and we need to be just a better person, and we just need to allow that to happen. Is that what we're trying to achieve in terms of coaching? Is that what we're looking for, Cookie?
Yeah, definitely. I've heard the phrase language precedes culture, so or is it culture precedes language? I'm not sure, but you get the connection.
Yeah. And
I think if we want to change a culture, or we want to create a culture where people feel respected, people feel cared for, people feel connected to what's going on, then we probably do need to work on some of the language around that. We also need to identify, well, what does that actually mean? So what does caring mean? What does caring look like? What are the behaviors? Because I see a lot of maybe clubs or organizations that have like really impressive strap lines or logos, or whatever the descriptors of what the organization is, but sometimes they're just words. No one ever writes the motivational logo on the wall. I've had this conversation before, but nobody ever writes we're crap and we don't care. They'll write something quite uplifting and motivating, and something which maybe reflects the culture or the environment that they would like to have, or they think they have, which is great. But then living those values and creating those values to become something real is so important. And there's obviously work that any organization or club or whatever needs to do to make that a reality. You mentioned the language and the terminology, and what in the email, how the term psychological safety, how often the term psychological safety is used in literature and sort of day-to-day life. And she actually shows a really good chart. So in the early 2000s, minuscule in terms of how it's been used or termed. The first time that psychological safety seems to come out as a theoretical term comes from William Kahn in 1990. So that whenever people talk or write about it, that's generally seems to be a starting point, although some work was done prior to it, but the term psychological safety comes from there. And it shows you on this chart then in Amy's book how many, she had run a quite in-depth search, and up to, I think it was 2017, 2018 at that point, the chart is just going up here. So I think it is becoming more common, and you're right. If there's any way that we can simplify that further to try and go, well, this is what it's about, this is what it means, and this is what a psychologically safe environment might look like, then I think that may help coaches. But I think, it's like, for me, it's an area that could easily be included in coach development, coach education. Finding out, first of all, is it important to coaches? Do coaches actually see this as an important thing? Is it something that they want to create? Or are they happy with, something that isn't psychologically safe? And why, if they are happy? So those are questions that I have in my mind at the minute. But I think language and terminology is a big part of that area.
And I think when we look at vulnerability, we have to look at it from a relationship point of view. And you've got usually two distinct types of people. You have a coach or a teacher who, I'm just going to stereotype and say they're maybe a little bit older than their pupils. Maybe you come from a different era, generation, coach, education, family background, personality traits. So they come with this huge box of tricks. And then you've got the pupils, the players who maybe are from a different generation who need something a little bit different now. And then what we've got to do is we've got to try to pull the two together, because if we're creating this psychological safe area, then we have to create it that everybody feels safe in it. And if the coach doesn't feel safe, then the first thing they're going to do is to maybe express that in a way that the player or the pupil becomes uncomfortable and they don't feel safe, and therefore the whole vulnerability opportunity is lost then, isn't it?
Totally. As a teenager, I used to work in a well-known supermarket, which I won't say the name of, and I used to work here.
Because GF International Solutions Chit Chats are looking for a Marks and Spencer sponsorship deal for next year.
No, I wasn't there. And I'll save your lawyers any hassle by not stating who it was. But I just remember thinking it was just a teenager who worked there on the weekends. But goodness, I was a pressure cooker. And I started to think about, well, why is it just one person that's actually putting pressure on the staff? And I realized that it was actually a systematic thing. So senior leadership were putting pressure on regional leadership, who were putting pressure on individual store managers, who were putting pressure on individual store duty managers, who were putting pressure on the staff on the ground. And it was inherent right the way throughout the organization that psychological safety was not present. You were a number, and your job was to get through the tunnel as possible. And then there are other organizations where other companies have decided actually we want a psychologically safe environment because we feel that it will allow our staff to be more creative, it'll allow our staff to learn better, to solve problems better, and to give a really safe working environment for people where they enjoy coming to work and they feel like they're connected and they're safe. And if they are vulnerable, it's okay to be vulnerable. And the Google Aristotle project was one that's been written about probably most prominently. And a large slice of that project identified that a psychologically safe environment again changes how we learn or influence how we learn. And we're more likely to ask questions that we need the answers to, and we're more likely to feel fine about not knowing the answers and actually more curious about problem solving. I think from listening to Brene Brown, if you heard any of her stuff,
really good TED talk
on vulnerability. So brilliant TED talk on vulnerability. And curiosity or not knowing sometimes demonstrates vulnerability, and that's fine. It's okay to not know the answers. And I think if you're actually committed to finding out what those answers are, you're in a really good place because you'll learn something.
And I guess if anybody's listening to this and they're turning around and saying, well, actually, you guys are just talking about people being nicer and kinder and more understanding in terms of the connection. Yes, absolutely, all of that. But I think there's something which is even more important than that. If we can create a right environment, there are loads of pockets of research in multiple disciplines that will suggest that there's an acceleration of learning, there's an acceleration of engagement, and there's a further push towards mastery experiences in a variety of different areas that if you create that will happen.
And it's important just to pick up on the first point you said. So it's important when we're talking about psychological safety to say what psychological safety is not. So it's not, some people think it's this pink fluffy thing that everyone will sit around in a circle and it doesn't matter if something messes up, we'll be fine. It's not about lowering standards. It's not about I don't really care if it's not about if I don't do anything and I don't do my job, there'll be no consequences. But it's very much about actually being productive and feeling safe in that productive environment and problem solving and all the things that we've talked about, and how we experience those. So it's important that we don't see, psychologically safety as a cop out, that we don't have to do any work, or, I'm not going to do any work today, but I feel psychologically safe that I don't have to do any work. So it's not about that. And as we talked about, Wooden and Summit and Klopp, that we can actually still achieve performances and results at the very highest level. Google, in a business context, we can achieve the highest results at the highest level, but we can still do it in a way that everyone feels amazing.
And I know that we always talk about sport as this metaphor for life, but I think sometimes we have to look at life and start to implement some of the lessons that you can learn from life back into sport. So somebody like Google and what they've done, for example, and some of the things that Nike have done over the years as well, they've just been exceptional organizations that have looked after their staff, developed their staff, but allowed their staff to flourish. And I think that's what one of the key words in the world of sport we should be looking for is we should never stifle. I'm going to use the word talent because I'm going to have another 3-day conversation with you on defining talent, aren't I? But let's just say talent for what it is right now. I want the talent to flourish. I don't ever want it to kind of be stifled. But actually, let's say, for example, you're not talented, particularly talented, and you just want to run around a little bit and have a bit of fun. Well, it depends on what level that you're at. I need to allow that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what I would always encourage coaches to do is, identify what the principles are. What are your principles? And a lot of coaches that I speak to, they'll talk about one of their principles being, for example, fun. So they want their environments to be fun. They want it to be hardworking and productive, but they want it to be fun. And we want to have fun while we're achieving results and achieving performances, or developing or whatever. And I think that's important. And who doesn't like fun? So if that's present in the environment, I think we're off to a good start there. Sometimes what I also feel, and again in my own coaching, I'll see this all the time as well, is whenever your behavior actually conflicts your principles, and you've done a session and or you've done a block of sessions, or you've done a period of coaching, and you look back on it and go, did my principles, did my the things that underpin my coaching philosophy, were they present in those sessions? Sometimes you'll say yes, and sometimes you'll say no. In any given particular interaction or any particular session, you might find that actually the things that you're passionate about, the things that you think are really, you want to be present in your coaching and in your interactions as a human being, if they aren't present, sometimes gives you an uneasy feeling in your stomach, because on intuition that actually what I'm trying to create here is not going the way I want it to go, or I haven't behaved in a way that reflects my principles and how I feel I should be coaching or should be interacting with others.
And I certainly think that's where the world of emotional intelligence comes in, because unless you're emotionally aware, first and foremost, you can't use your emotional intelligence. And I have seen over the years some coaches who've been phenomenal at having the right values, having the right philosophies, right until the point they can see the goal. And then that just goes out the window, boom. And it's almost this revert back to, I must win. My ego's come up a little bit. My psychological safety zone's gone. Everything's out the window, and we're having this again. And unfortunately, I still see that a little bit, but we need to work on that a little bit harder, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think, I remember, and it wasn't that long ago, but I remember coaching in a tournament, and a team who we should have on paper been beaten. We lost 1-0, scored no goal, and it was one of those games where every attack just they seemed to stop it. And I remember it was a fairly decent crowd there for a youth game, so it was under 17s, and it was one of those ones where my principles around that age group was very much help them have a brilliant football experience. We're getting towards that stage where winning might become a little bit more important, so definitely we want to be trying to win the games and really focusing on winning the games, but not to the detriment of their development. So the development bit probably still comes first and foremost at that stage. And I remember in the club, and it took me a while to reflect back on it, but because I didn't want to revisit that just straight away. But you know, and recent years have really reflected in that period, because I thought about my feelings and my emotions at that point in the closing minutes of the game, and it was all about my ego. And I was sitting around, and I had loads of parents and stuff behind me, and spectators, and people who know me, and I was thinking about myself in that time, and I should have been going back to what my principles were, in relation to helping those players develop and helping those players get a great experience. And I don't think I did that day, and I think the reason I didn't is because of my ego. And I think again, big lesson for me as a coach, and I've thought about that a lot since. I've thought about what I would do differently. And I thought about, actually, if I was faced with that situation again, would I, behave how I behaved, or would I be able to check those emotions and be able to say, no, look, this is a lesson, and even though we've lost, that is not a reflection on me. That's not a reflection on the players. It's a learning experience, and it's one game in hopefully, hundreds of, maybe thousands of games that they're going to play throughout their lifetime. And that was definitely an example of where my philosophy or my principles and my behaviors, thoughts and emotions didn't connect.
And it's tough. It's tough in the world of sport because it can be pressured. And we've talked about ego quite a bit. And for me, I don't think ego is necessarily a negative. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think everybody has one to a level. Sports people tend to use it as a big mask in order to actually cope with the outside world a little bit. I was talking to Kieran Brady the other day when he was a pro football player, and he was saying that you got 40,000 people shouting your name at 17, 18-year-old. Nobody does that with the postman. Nobody follows the postman around and says, "Oh, you walked up that path wrong, and you dropped the letter there, and boo, you're not very good." So there can be a lot of pressure. So you have to have something in terms of some resilience there, some emotional strength, some kind of ego, and some kind of protective mechanism as well. I'm glad you brought up football, Cookie, because we both love football, and whilst you are a Liverpool fan and Jurgen Klopp has done a really good job, I'd just like to say that the whole team is still run by a Sunderland boy, by the way, as well. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about. I was talking to a Premiership football player over the last couple of weeks who I've known for quite some time now. And we were talking just about the game. And I was discussing this vulnerability and linked to talent and ability, linked to COVID-19 in the Premiership, the way that it looks now. And he was saying that it's more difficult to mark some of the more flair players now because they're playing with more freedom. So do you think if we take away the 40, 60, 70,000 worth of fans in the ground, are we seeing more flair? Are we seeing more freedom of play? We're certainly, in my opinion, it seems like we're seeing more goals. The stats will probably tell me at the end of the season, but it feels like the game is more open, more expansive now. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to say, like it seems, certainly in the Premier League, it seems to be one of those seasons where, as I say, a Liverpool fan, I never thought I'd see a 7-2 defeat to Aston Villa. But then again, they went out and scored 7 themselves on Saturday. And you look at some of the games that have happened this year, some really strange results. And it is different. So, there seem like in its very nature, it's played in a slightly later date. There's no crowds there, or limited crowds as coming back into the stadiums, and I think that by its very nature, that difference may cause some sort of small difference, because you may have players out there that actually the crowd really unnerves them. And again, I'll go back to people will be, if there's any non-Liverpool fans, they'll probably have turned this off by now, but you go back to Champions League semi-final, Barcelona versus Liverpool at Anfield, 3-0 down, came back to 1-4-0, and you hear even like the current best player in the world, Messi, talking about, they felt like they couldn't breathe in the stadium, and the crowd played a major part. You also may have players that feed off that energy, and that they want the crowd there, and that when they hear the noise coming through and they hear the 40,000 people chanting their name, that's a major driver. And I think, we've seen some home defeats for different teams, and a lot of the pundits will be talking about, if the crowd had been there, would that have been 6-1? Because they wouldn't have let it get to 6-1 because the crowd would have been on their backs and they might have tried a little bit harder. Conversations like that. So I definitely think there are changes going on at the minute in the world of football and the world of sport in general. It's not sport how we knew it, but obviously there's bigger goals out there in terms of keeping people safe at the minute. So.
Well, I certainly think there would be more goals if the goals were bigger.
Well, that would help. Or sometimes if you're playing Sunderland, there's a good chance of scoring a few in there as well. So.
Listen, we could have goals that small. But I can't believe you went down that route. And where's my safety? Where's my psychological safe moment right now? You're bringing up that. If the ombudsman is watching, there's a little bit of bullying going on.
This is a moment where my behaviours and my philosophy are conflicting again. So sorry about that.
That's because it's 3 o'clock, the whistle's gone, and all of a sudden you're in football mindset, isn't it? It's really difficult because we're talking about something which I think is really important. It's 2020. The world has changed. We're generations away from where we were now. There's more understanding, there's more knowledge, there's certainly more learning there, but we still have this built-in culture sometimes. And that's difficult to get away from it. It's difficult to kind of say, well, actually, 20, 30 years ago, this is how it happened. So it's tough to judge. But what I don't agree with is that you can't use that as an excuse. You can't turn around and say it's okay for me to bully that player because that's how we did it 20, 30 years ago. And I'm sure I've told you the story about working with Ronnie Moore when I was at Hartlepool. And Ronnie was talked about being a bit of a dinosaur as a football manager. And I never thought that. And the reason why I never thought that was because he realized that there was some kind of psychology stuff that needed to be done. He didn't really necessarily buy into it himself. I don't think he necessarily understood how it would work and how it would help. But the difference between, in my opinion, being a dinosaur and not being a dinosaur is if you're a dinosaur, you don't do anything about it. You're aware of it, but you just blow it off. If you're not a dinosaur, you kind of go, I'll bring somebody in to help me out with that. And I hope it helps and works.
Yeah. And culture is very difficult to change because it's, something that we've been used to for a very long time. It's sort of dictated behaviors in a lot of environments, not just sport. But it doesn't necessarily, just justify, that that's the way it always should be and always will be. And I remember, almost 10 years ago now, I was very fortunate to go on a football trip to China. So we took kids out from here, allowed them to experience Chinese culture, and we trained every day and played a few games. And I remember, I still can't believe this, but one of the Chinese coaches, we had just our team had beaten them, and I remember him really giving off to one of his players, and the player looked at the ground or dismissed him in some way, and he like slapped him on the chest. And I remember just thinking that shouldn't happen. I think if it was I was obviously a younger coach at that point, but I think if it was now, I would maybe go down and confront him. But yeah, it was just, and I said to our guy who was liaison between us and the Chinese team, and he had said, yeah, something like in some places that might be the culture, and I was like, I didn't, just because that's the culture doesn't mean it's right, and I think again, looking around the world at the minute, you'll see like I love disruptors to cultures as well. So things like Airbnb, what a brilliant idea, you know, hotel prices on the rise all the time, and then all of a sudden this company comes up where you can stay somewhere for potentially a lot cheaper. And I think prices have went up in recent years, but certainly as an idea, Uber, you know, changed you know, transfers and taxis and things like that.
Just Eat, another one as well. So instead of, you know, takeaways being delivered from all over, there's so many who have just they've evolved the culture, but that's normal, isn't it? If we live outside of our 40 to 50 years that we've been around, and we go back 250, 500, 1,000 years, this is just normal progression in society, isn't it?
Yeah, evolution is, you know, it happens, like, and it's probably a necessity. And like, even I was on Twitter the other day and seeing some guy who commutes on an electric scooter in New York. So he jumps on a scooter, and his work is like 3 or 4 miles away, and he's able just to he doesn't have to take the subway. He gets there slightly quicker than the subway would take him, puts his helmet on, charges his scooter at home, and off he goes. And you know, that to me is an evolution. It's a societal evolution and again we're sort of changing. You know, how we, like, a lot of, again, same thing, people are driving electric cars. So again, that's not particularly our culture at the minute, but it's moving towards, you know, people caring more about the environment, understanding what the issues are with fossil fuels, and leading towards driving electric cars. And I've seen, it's like, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 countries who have recently just committed to ending fossil fuel cars by 2030. And I think Norway had committed to ending it by 2025, so they're being really ambitious. So I think all those sorts of things, actually, you look at this and go, well, is it going to improve our communities or society, or, you know, in some cases nations, in some cases global population? Are those things going to improve? And I think in a lot of cases, certainly in terms of going greener, in terms of our energy, will definitely help a lot of people and help the planet too.
And I'm certainly waiting for my hoverboard to come out. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go back to 2020. So if I'm going to go back to the future, I'm going to go 2021. It's going to be a good year next year. Cookie, listen, it's been great having a chat about philosophy, about cultures, about behaviors. They all, I think, are part of a psychological safe area, safe zone, safe environment. If you're a young coach going out there right now, you're just learning the trade. You want to be a good coach, but you're just starting things off, and you've got some pressure from parents to win, and from kids because they want to play better, and from maybe the school because the school team has had a history of winning. Yeah, you understand that by creating a really good, safe camp, safe environment, it's going to accelerate learning, develop, and enhance the players further down the line. What would your top tips be to that coach right now?
Yeah, so a really good question. For me, sitting down with all the stakeholders before, you know, a ball is kicked or a ball is, you know, whacked with a tennis racket or whatever sport you're working in.
Is that a technical term, by the way, whacked?
I think it is.
Are you using that?
I find it, like, I've definitely heard a tennis commentator saying they whacked one down the line there. No, but so, you know, getting open and honest and showing really good communication at the beginning and saying, look, this is what this program, this club, this environment is going to be about. This is how we're going to do things. This is how we're going to try and achieve what we want to achieve, and what we want to achieve is this. And generally being able to say why. You know, because if you can tell people, and sometimes Simon Sinek will start with why, potentially start there. So if your why is around the development of those players, a holistic development, or your why is whatever, being able to communicate that, I think, creates an understanding from that parent or that coach or that club official or whoever it is that you're talking to, and allows them to see why it is that you're doing what you're doing. I think if you don't have that conversation, your methods or your philosophy or your strategies are always open to interpretation of, and they still might be, but at least you've been able to try and communicate that. So having that early initial conversation, engaging people, allowing them to understand, because if they understand, it will help you in the long run. And that's something that's quite important. Now, obviously, to begin to do that, so if I'm going to, if I'm a young coach and I want to talk to my parents or my stakeholders that are around the environment about my philosophy, about how I'm going to do things, I need to plan that. So at the minute, or I need to spend some time in that space thinking about it. At the minute, planning sometimes becomes a session plan.
Yeah.
And maybe even like a season planner, or macro and micro cycles and so on. But actually, I think some of the most important planning that any coach can do is the deeper stuff. So what's your philosophy? What are your motivations? What do you want to achieve in a more holistic sense, rather than session 1, week 1, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. That can still be important, but actually the deeper stuff and the more enriching stuff comes from that side of things, your philosophy, what you want to achieve, the holistic side of things, for players or people. You don't necessarily have to see them as players; they can be just people, and that's really important. So having that as a starting point, I think, is really useful, because that helps you set your direction. And once you know the direction that you're on, that makes things easier. And also would say that two things: mentors are so important. So if you're a young coach out there, find someone who you can relate to, find someone who is willing to help you and support you, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a more experienced person in that sport. That could be someone who's in another sport. That could be someone who's maybe not involved in sport at all, but knows a lot about, say, depending on what age group you're working with, or are you working with adults, someone who knows about people and connecting with people and supporting people to achieve their goals. How have they done it? And for me, a really good mentor is not necessarily someone who gives you all the right answers, but someone who asks all the right questions to help you develop your own learning. And the other thing is just there's so much learning out there, or opportunity. Sorry, there's so much opportunities to learn out there. Yeah. A lot of the most effective coaches that I have ever seen, the greatest coaches that I've ever seen, devour books, watch videos constantly, and are really reflective of their own learning. So they'll take that information and turn it into knowledge, because they're able to reflect in a way that allows them to relate that to their own environment, to their own practice, to their own intricacies as a person. And I think that will be that learning is out there, and get out there and access it and make sense of it. Not just copy it, because taking this environment and what they do in this environment and shoving it into what you do in your environment doesn't necessarily work. But actually there may be bits that you can pinch across and take across.
Cookie,
so yeah,
that's some great knowledge. I love that, and I just want to wrap that up, because I'm quite conscious of time as well. As one, I love the depth of looking at philosophies and looking at your own personality traits, and I think that's where the vulnerability of coaches is maybe at a tipping point, because unless you can look inside a little bit more and be more honest and be more open and look at yourself first, you're always going to struggle, because you're not really honest. And that's where, when you look at that philosophy, I think you have to live it a little bit. You have to believe in the behaviors and buy into them yourselves and really live that. And then I think that the last thing is that if people don't believe anything that me and you say, and that's fine, just go and watch the Netflix documentary with Jose Mourinho at Sporting Lisbon about creating an environment and creating a safe zone for people to grow beyond their ability levels and to form a team and to be massively successful as well. So Cookie, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure chatting with you and catching up.
Likewise, Graham. Thank you very much for having me on.
Cheers.
I've just